Hi, I'm Sam Roberts from Roberts Geospatial. Welcome to part 4 of my 4-part series on modern raster technology. Today we're looking at rasters in MapInfo Pro. So rasters, grids and images have always been an integral part of MapInfo Pro. And to complement the basic visualization and interrogation capabilities in MapInfo Pro, users could purchase Vertical Mapper, which was sold separately, to provide advanced raster processing capabilities and improved rendering features. But in version 15 of MapInfo Pro, a new raster visualization and processing add-in was created by MapInfo, and it was sold as MapInfo Pro Advanced. So it was designed to replace both the existing raster capabilities in MapInfo Pro and the Vertical Mapper processing package. And it's now bundled into a Pro subscription when you get the latest version of Pro. So old versions of MapInfo Pro distinguish between rasters and grids, and these were treated separately. And a raster in this context refers to a located image, whereas today we would call this a raster with an image field. And a grid referred to either continuous, multibanded data or classified data, and today we would refer to these as a raster with a continuous field or a classified field. So MapInfo Pro uses raster handlers and grid handlers to load rasters and grids of different formats. And this is the old system, right? Not the new system. And a variety are still shipped with MapInfo Pro. Now these files have a .rh extension and a .gh extension, but in fact they're just DLLs, and they have several standard function signatures which they must provide, and it allows MapInfo Pro to invoke them. So let's have a quick look. If we look in the MapInfo Professional folder, and if you do a search for star.rh, you can see there's a variety of RH something or other files. So tiff.rhl, vmgrid.rhl. Down here you see mirasterhandler.rha. That's the latest one. The trailing character after the RH can be anything from A through to Z, and the order in which the handlers are invoked by MapInfo when it's trying to open a raster depends on the alphabetical order of the handler names. So consequently, you could play silly buggers with this system and go and rename these handlers to reorder or to change the order in which they're invoked by MapInfo Pro. So when MapInfo Pro wanted to load a raster or a grid, and the grid handlers had a star.gh something extension. So here ArcGrid, for example, MIG is the old MapInfo grid format. So to load a raster or a grid, MapInfo will invoke these handlers in alphabetical order until one successfully opens the raster. And after that, it will use that handler from there on. So you saw in the File Explorer there was a new handler which was shipped with the MapInfo Pro Advanced product. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about this new handler. So MapInfo Pro Advanced provides a new handler, and this ships with MapInfo Pro regardless of whether you have the Advanced package licensed or not. So it has an RHA extension, so it's invoked ahead of all the other legacy raster handlers. So in effect, because it loads all the different raster formats, that new raster handler that ships with Advanced and with every version of MapInfo Pro now replaces all of the existing handlers, and they simply just don't get invoked anymore, even though the system still exists. So the Advanced Raster Handler can load many different raster formats, and internally it uses a vehicle and a driver nomenclature. So native drivers provide all of the code to read and or write rasters of many common formats. And then for more or less common formats, Advanced uses a driver that uses the open source GDAL raster library. Now, GDAL supports dozens and dozens of different raster formats, both old and new. So the advanced raster handler has the modern raster engine sitting behind it and powering it. So a single instance of this engine is created to load all of the rasters. And that's unlike the legacy raster handlers. So the legacy raster handlers will, every time they're invoked, they will go and open the raster and read some data out of it and close it again. But the advanced raster handler doesn't do that. So rasters opened by the new engine remain open whilst they're in use. And this allows the system to cache the tile data and the metadata, and that allows us to improve performance in many ways. So unlike the legacy handlers, the new handler can open and display huge rasters and take advantage of overview resolution levels to provide linear performance for rendering or processing at any scale. And it provides this guarantee for any raster format that it opens by caching data in advance and storing it on disk if necessary. So this allows, unlimited zooming in and zooming out by generating underview and overview tiles. So just go back to my file explorer. Here we go. So, so often you'll see some files associated with your raster. So for example, you'll see here we have a TIFF file, and down here you've got the TIFF file renamed _TIFF.pprc. So you often see a pprc file associated with a legacy format raster. And this is an overview cache, and it's similar to the .ovr file that you'll use in GDAL and QGIS and ArcGIS. In addition to pprc files, you'll sometimes see a tprc. This is also a cache file, and you'll see that with some other kinds of formats like ArcASCII formats, for example. You also see a GHX file. So if we edit this, this particular GHX file has got statistics in it for that TIFF. You'll also find in here the rendering properties of the raster. So if you render that raster in MapInfo Pro, how you render it is written into that GHX file in that one place. So let's get rid of that. Let's talk about rendering. So the advanced raster handler will render the raster. Now remember that it's a raster handler, so it's not providing data back to MapInfo Pro, it's providing a located image back to MapInfo Pro. So the rendering is written into the raster handler, and that's where the pixels get generated, the grid or image or classified raster or whatever it is gets rendered into a located image, and that's what gets sent back to Pro. So rendering properties are edited via the user interface in Advanced Color Dialog. So let's just bring that up, shall we? Just have a quick look at it. So here's MapInfo, raster. So open a table. Get to go into, oops, sorry. Okay, there's our good old Merit DM. So if we go to the raster ribbon, you'll see here a button for advanced color. That brings up a dialog. You can also select here from the ribbon, so this allows you to select the field. This allows you to set the rendering style, so pseudo color, RGB, or classified. You can then select the band. There are some pop-ups for choosing your color stretch. So this is the transformation that converts your data through to a color index, which is then mapped against a color table. You can choose your color table. There's a pop-up here for your hill shading, so you can set your hill shading. There's some advanced options there. Brings up that dialog. And then if you need more than that, then you go into the Advanced Color Dialog, and that brings up this tool here. Here you can set all these things, as well as clip limits and various modifications to the data transform and so forth. So you can set many properties via the raster ribbon. Color lookup style rendering is supported, where your data transform is applied to the raster to transform data to a color index, and then that color index is used to acquire a color from an external lookup table. RGB style rendering is also supported, and we saw that up here, for example, where we have pseudo. This is a color lookup style rendering. This is your RGB style rendering, where each of the red, green, and blue channels are each transformed separately into color. And in both of those cases, you can apply the hill shading, so you can see that we've got some shadow on this raster. There are many limitations in this rendering system. The primary limitation is that because the rendering properties are written into the GHX file, which is associated with the raster, and there's only one of them, that means that a raster can only be rendered in one way in any map that you've got open in MapInfo, or in any separate instance of MapInfo that you have running. So that's a significant limitation. There's also inflexibility in the rendering algorithm. There's not a lot of flexibility or properties there. One thing that's problematic is that there isn't a specific image algorithm mode. So if you bring in an image, by default it will go through the red, green, blue layer type, rendering layer type, and then it will get stretched by default, and that's a bit painful. QGIS does the same kind of thing, but it means you have to go in and intervene to bring your image back to its true colors. Different coordinate systems, different cell size and field types cause issue with this rendering system. There's very limited transparency support, and one of the key issues for very large rasters is that there are performance issues related to coordinate system reprojection on the fly. Now, all of these problems are solvable, and there are ways to go about it. So let's go to the next slide. I just want to show you the raster preferences dialog. So if you go backstage area, go to Pro, in options, you can bring up preferences. So I just want to look at a couple of things in here. Most of these things I don't care about, some of these things I do. So firstly, on the display page, there's this Generate Raster Overview Cache. Now this should always be set to always, and it's not set to always by default. So there's a concept in the raster engine where you can choose either to use overview pyramids, which is what you should choose, or you can choose to decimate the base level on demand and on the fly, and use that to acquire overview pyramids on demand without caching anything. And so that can be useful. For example, if you've got a big TIFF file and you just want to see it immediately, that kind of thing can be useful to allow you to do that. But, you know, for me, this was an idea that was clever 15 years ago, but isn't clever anymore. So what you should do in any system, regardless whether it's MapInfo, QGIS, or anything else, you should generate an overview file so that you've got the highest possible quality rendering and you've got the best performance at all times. And that's what this setting controls. So if you set this to always, then it's always going to generate the overview file. Of course, once that's done, you don't need to do it again. So it happens the first time you open a raster. It might cause some delay whilst it's computing it, and thereafter it never has to happen again. So the next one is enable block access. I'm not going to explain what this is. It's just an optimization in the handler. it was implemented as a sort of in a later phase of the handler development, should be ticked on. One that people don't know about is disable alpha channel. So if you have imagery which has an alpha channel, then by default it will be used in MapInfo Pro, and so you might see some colors being faded out. Now that might be exactly what you want, but sometimes it's not what you want, and sometimes the system mistakes a fourth band in a raster as an alpha channel when it's not an alpha channel, and so you get basically some pollution of your imagery by this fake alpha channel. So you can switch this on or off here. Going to memory and performance. So there's an important one here, memory cache size. So the raster engine caches raster tiles in memory. So this can improve performance by reducing disk access and reducing the amount of data decompression and compute cycles that it has to do. So it's advantageous to set that to the maximum size. When you do, I think it consumes up to 50% of your system's memory. And that may compromise the operation of other software. So, whether or not you have it on the maximum is up to you. Just make a point about processing. Rasters, when they fit into memory, if they can fit into that cache, then your processing will be optimized. If they can't fit into the cache, and the cache can't be that big, you don't have that much memory, most large rasters won't fit into the cache. In that case, the size of the cache becomes relatively unimportant because it becomes ineffective. So I'll leave that up to you. I always set it to maximum, but maybe something like high or normal is more appropriate if you don't want other software to be impacted. So on the raster formats page, we're listing here the native formats and also the GDAL formats. So this is a list of all of the, so this native formats list is a list of all the native vehicles that can load different raster formats. So you can enable or disable these by hitting these buttons. If you disable one of these formats, so if I came in here, for example, and disabled, the TIFF driver, this one here, TIFF, big TIFF, GeoTIFF, that doesn't mean that TIFFs aren't going to get loaded because it will stop. So that will stop the native driver from loading a TIFF, but it's still using the GDAL driver, and you'll notice that that sits down here too. So somewhere in this list will be the GDAL. There it is, the GDAL multi-format driver. That's still enabled. You go into GDAL. Well, the GDAL driver loads GeoTIFFs too. So by switching it off in native formats, all you effectively do is push it into the GDAL driver rather than in the native driver. Now, they can load things like TIFF files differently, so sometimes people will do that. If you then switch it off in the GDAL driver, then it will go, and then the new advanced raster handler won't load it at all. But it may then be loaded by one of the old legacy raster handlers in MapInfo Pro. So there's kind of a system there. So the new raster handler gets the first crack at it with a native driver. If it doesn't load it, then the new raster handler through its GDAL driver will have another crack at it, and that will probably load it. But if that doesn't load it, then it will go through to the old raster handlers. So in the GDAL tab, you might notice that there's only a small number of formats listed in this tab, whereas the GDAL library supports dozens and dozens and dozens of formats. Now the reason they're not all listed here is not because they don't work, it's because they haven't been tested, and so we're being conservative about listing these here. But if you go to my website that's associated and you'll find the article about this talk, you'll see there's some tips there for how you can add in support for other formats that the GDAL library supports. So you need to go into the MapInfo Raster preferences file. It's an XML file, and do some editing in that, and you can add in support for additional formats via GDAL. Just go back to MapInfo Pro. So I was just going to talk quickly about the ribbon. So on the ribbon here, there's a couple of key settings. The first is this raster quality setting. Now I spoke about this in the interpolation video, where you can choose your nearest neighbor bilinear and two different spline methods for interpolation. This is used when you generate your underviews, and so if you zoom in, these methods will eventually be used as you get into a smaller and smaller scale in order to interpolate the raster data before it gets rendered. And of course, I also spoke about this none option, which bypasses that whole system and just renders the base resolution data, which then gets passed to Pro, and then Pro uses image processing to either upscale or downscale that image, and then you control that through this map image smoothing option, where you've got none, which is just pixels, low, which is bilinear, and high, which is bicubic. So I think we've gone through some slides there. Okay, so final slide, just want to talk about virtual rasters. So the new raster handler supports a variety of virtual raster formats. So a virtual raster is a description of a raster, usually drawing on data from other real rasters. And the raster engine generates the virtual raster data in real time and on demand when it's asked for it, according to the supplied instructions which are inside the virtual raster file. And that file will just be some kind of text file or XML file. So MapInfo has invented its own virtual raster format, and these files are identified by a MVR extension, but they're actually just XML files. The file contains XML commands that tell the engine how to construct the virtual raster. There's also a GDAL virtual raster implementation, and those files have a .vrt extension, and VRT files are supported by the new raster handler via the GDAL driver, if that's enabled in the preferences, which it is by default. And there is a kind of a second kind of virtual raster, which MapInfo has invented, and it's identified by the MRD extension. And this is a rendering algorithm, and again this file is just an XML file. So when you load an MRD virtual raster or rendering algorithm, there's a rendering engine invoked in real time to render the algorithm in demand. So I just want to speak briefly about that rendering engine. So when you render a raster in Pro, in MapInfo Pro Advanced, today you'll use the pixels that you see on screen are generated by the raster handler. That's where the code is that does the rendering. Now, because of all the limitations of that system, when I was an engineer with MapInfo Pro, I decided that we needed a new rendering engine. There is some history to this. I mean, when we wrote the original raster handler, we knew that we were doing the wrong thing. We knew that it wasn't the right way to go, but of course there are always time constraints and resource constraints, and it's just how we had to do it at the time. But later on we were able to come back to it and write a new and very advanced raster rendering engine. So that engine sits inside the MapInfo Pro Advanced Raster engine, and it's almost completely, totally unused. You can't access it, it's not used anywhere. However, you can access it via these MRD virtual rasters. So an MRD virtual raster has its own driver inside the engine, and in that driver it will invoke this new rendering engine to render the raster, and then it goes out through the raster handler and goes into Pro as an image. So for an MRD virtual raster, unlike an MVR or a VRT, you won't get continuous fields or anything like that. It will look like an image field. But the rendering algorithm itself might draw on rasters of all sorts of different kinds and on many different rasters. So this rendering engine is substantially superior to the rendering capability in the handler and was designed to replace it, and perhaps one day it will. But in the meantime, the only way to get access to it is via the MRD file, and that's why I've been working on some new software called Pro Raster, which creates these MRD virtual rasters which you can load into Pro to access this new rendering capability. So MRDs, let me move more specific. MVRs, virtual rasters, can be used to overcome some of the existing capability gaps in the raster handler rendering. So, for example, if you have an RGB algorithm, at present you have to draw the data from a multi-banded raster. You can't draw it from multiple different rasters. So if you download, for example, a Landsat tile and try to display it in Pro, you'll get each different band in a different TIFF file, and you won't be able to use that RGB algorithm. So that's a major restriction. On the other hand, it's really easy to overcome with virtual rasters. You can create a virtual raster that combines all those TIFF files into a single multi-banded raster, and then you can take it into the existing raster rendering capability in MapInfo Pro. However, there are a few tools to do that. There are some tools, and there are more coming out in MapInfo Pro and MapInfo Pro Advanced. So virtual rasters, both MVR and VRT, can be used as an alternative to many of the processing operations in MapInfo Pro Advanced. And the advantage of doing that is that you'll be able to see the result immediately. It won't have to run any potentially lengthy processing operation. And so if you have huge source rasters, you can save an enormous amount of time and an enormous amount of disk space. So for example, if you have a 200 gigabyte terrain raster and you want to run some kind of perhaps a calculator operation on that raster, well, to do that might take hours and hours of processing, and at the end of it you'll have another grid on your disk which is another 200 gigabytes. On the other hand, if you use virtual rasters, you can see the results on screen immediately without any delay, without any processing, and without any disk space usage. So they're really, really handy. Of course, there are also disadvantages, and in some aspects they don't work exactly the same or as perfectly. Sometimes they can't duplicate exactly what you see if you do processing, and you will see some strange effects in some unusual circumstances. But overall, they're a really good option, and they're appearing more and more in MapInfo Pro Advanced, so more of the processing operations now give you an option to output a virtual raster instead of actually executing the processing. So that's an introduction to rasters in MapInfo Pro, and that's the end of my 4-part series on modern raster technology and modern rasters. So I hope you find that informative. Bye now.